Hello, everyone. People will be coming in because their classes end at 12. I know that there are sort of various people trickling in, so if we leave the doors open at the back. But welcome, and those of you who are perched somewhere uncomfortable, it says reserved down here. You don't have to reserve those seats. We'll come and sit down the front. Welcome to the latest in our lectures, in our Journalism After Snowden series. I'm really thrilled that we've got Ethan Zuckerman here, because really this whole thing was his idea. He came to the journalism school just over a year ago, gave an absolutely brilliant and dynamic talk on journalism's role in the public space, and said, you know, why is nobody having this conversation? So it was his idea, actually, that we picked up on and said, he's absolutely right, this is the right place to be having these important conversations about what happens to the public sphere and what happens to journalism, now that we know what we know as a result of the NSA disclosures. So, as I say, I'm particularly thrilled that he's here. And without further ado, if you have your lunch boxes, pick them up and sit down and settle in. Ethan is also an exponent, I think, of really understanding how journalism should interact with the open web. He was a founder of Global Voices, which was, I think, one of the few examples of where we had a truly social platform being formulated in response to a journalistic need, and still remains as one of the only examples of that. He is an extraordinary thinker. He's an even more extraordinary speaker, so you're in for a complete treat. And it's a real privilege to have him here today. So Ethan, tell us about normalizing surveillance. Thank you very much.
So Emily has set me up in two different ways here. First of all, I have to confess, I had no idea that I had any role in sort of this project, this volume coming together. So that's complete news to me, although I have to say I'm thrilled that the journalism school has taken this on. I do think it's a really interesting, timely conversation about journalism in the public sphere. But I also want to say that the interesting thing about when Columbia Journalism School and someone as prominent and visible as Emily decides to sort of announce a volume, really smart people sort of stand up and say, all right, I'm going to write chapters in this. And if you're sort of an amateur in this space, as I am, since I've never worked in a real world newsroom, you sort of look at this and say, well, maybe I'll help out around the side. I'll sort of talk about what I talk about, but please don't ask me to deal with the main implications of the Snowden revelations. And then, of course, you discover that you're the only one on stage, and you actually have to sort of take it on. But I'm not. I'm going to acknowledge that there's an enormous set of issues raised about the role of the press in the wake of the revelations coming out from the documents Snowden and perhaps others have leaked about the NSA, GCHQ, and other government surveillance of otherwise apparently private communications networks. But what I actually want to focus on is this question of how did surveillance become the default state for the internet? And that's a conversation really about business models. That's a conversation about sort of 20 years of web history. And I want to think about sort of that social construction of a surveilled space. And at the end of it, ask what I hope are actually some fairly uncomfortable questions for journalism as a field about what our obligations are regarding surveillance. So my apology is I'm not going to cover everything related to this story. I don't think I could anyway, and I would ask you to please see this sort of in the context of this larger set of issues where we're talking about this. Clearly, we're going to see changes in how reporting takes place in the wake of Snowden. We're going to see newsrooms get much smarter and savvier around digital technologies, around source protection, and clearly this is a transformative moment if you are a newspaper that works on deep investigative stories. The trick in some ways is that it probably has not yet been a transformative moment in terms of public reaction. And I think for many of us, this was enormously surprising. These revelations that large American companies were handing over huge amount of information without alerting their users to the NSA, the fact that very large-scale metadata collection was taking place seems like the sort of thing that would draw people into the streets. And so far, it just hasn't drawn more than a few thousand folks into the streets. And so one of the things that I want to suggest is that the Snowden revelations in some ways may actually be the least surprising surprise we've had in recent memory, which is to say, while it was extremely surprising that the US government was involved with surveilling communications in this fashion, it was absolutely no surprise at all that communications were being surveilled in this fashion. And so essentially what happened was in the digital security community, where I sort of hang my hat occasionally, there were basically two schools of thought. School of thought one was there were countries out there that were very actively surveilling their communications, and the US probably wasn't one of them because we're a democratic country with strong traditions of oversight. Or, as folks like my friend Jake Applebaum argued, you got to be crazy. The US government is probably doing this to a much greater scale than all the other governments that were out there. But the actual mechanisms through which surveillance were taking place were not especially surprising. You have groups like Citizen Lab up at the University of Toronto that had done an incredibly thorough job of documenting how many of these technologies worked. So we knew that there were kits that you could download if you were, say, Bahraini law enforcement, and install and use as a way to compromise individual people's computers so that you could come in, capture their messages before they were encrypted for transit, and have access to exactly what they were saying. We also knew from sort of past experience that certain governments, like the government of Tunisia, had dumped huge amounts of resources into seizing people's network credentials. So Tunisia, under Ben Ali, had actually set up their own landing page for Facebook, where for 5 minutes out of every hour, you would attempt to log into Facebook and you would essentially hand over your login details to the Tunisian government. They would save it at a later date. They would log into Facebook. They would document your social network and do exactly the same sort of metadata analysis that in many cases we are now deeply concerned about. So we knew this was happening. The question was where it was happening. And discovering that it was happening in the US with very little oversight and with misrepresentations to Congress was deeply troubling and unsettling. But at the same time, anyone who knew this space knew where the vulnerabilities were in these networks. And we knew them because we were helping dissidents in other countries try to figure out how to protect themselves from the surveillance possibilities that these platforms made very, very simple. There's another sense in which the Snowden story was extremely unsurprising, and it's the sense in which professional journalism helps with whistleblower stories. So the nature of whistleblowing is that someone is going to reveal one or more documents that are hidden information that are almost certainly going to require some level of interpretation to make them understandable. When we look back in history, when we look to something like the Pentagon Papers, even this very thoughtfully, actually quite well-written history of America's role in Vietnam demanded quite a bit of interpretation from the popular press to sort of understand all the implications coming out of this. And in this sense, the NSA documents that came out demanded vastly more interpretation than we had sort of expected before. When you actually look at the documents as they come out, they're basically unreadable. And I've had the experience of talking with some of the computer security people who have been tasked by The Guardian, by The Washington Post, by other journalistic outlets with the unenviable task of deciphering these things. And they're treating it, very much the way that we treat code breaking. You start writing down algorithms or code words, and you try to figure out somewhere else in this whole massive ciphertext where they might reveal to you what that means. And once you find out, oh, that's interesting, I think that means AT&T, you can then come back and try to decipher the rest of the documents. But sort of handing over the revelations actually doesn't do very much. The documents that are shared require this massive interpretive framework, first of all, to figure them out, and then second of all, to try to figure out what they actually mean in context. And so for people who take journalism seriously and take this sort of role of investigative journalism seriously, it's actually very reassuring to sort of look at this sort of revelation. And it's actually quite similar with WikiLeaks. We have this information out here, but no, the story doesn't tell itself. It actually demands an enormous amount of investigation and interpretation to try to figure out how to get the story out there. But perhaps even more importantly, it also requires something that professional newsrooms are very experienced at, and digital newsrooms are just now learning how to do, which is trying to figure out how you back your reporters up with lawyers. Particularly in the UK, there has been enormous government pressure put on The Guardian regarding these revelations. And The Guardian went through a number of extremely uncomfortable conversations, threatened with cancellation of publication through various different invocations of national secrecy, finally ended up in this sort of symbolic state of destroying the hard drives that they had put the documents on, while making it very clear to the people supervising the destruction of this physical property that the documents existed in digital space in a lot of different places. This doesn't happen without a great deal of legal backup, essentially saying, we're going to work very, very hard to make sure you're able to put this information out, despite an enormous amount of legal pressure. And in fact, we know this doesn't happen because we've seen what's happened to some of the other players who've come under enormous political pressure. You've had firms like LavaBit essentially say, I don't have the lawyers to fight this off. I'm simply going to stop running my service because I know that I'm not able to operate under this level of government scrutiny. Whereas you've had newspapers essentially saying, this is part of why you want a strong, independent, free press, is that we have the legal backup to be able to do this and to do this in a way where these stories sort of end up coming out. Now, I would point out that as we feel really good about the fact that there's an ongoing role for The Guardian, for The Washington Post, for other organizations around this, it is worth remembering that these documents were handed to a deeply outsider journalist who's become more mainstream in the process, but generally speaking, Greenwald has been seen as sort of being well outside of the ordinary journalistic fraternity and handed over through an activist filmmaker. So while we sort of pat ourselves on the back and sort of hope that, this is a reinforcement of the role for journalism as we know it, there is a very interesting sense in which Snowden's choices about who he went to and how he went to those people may signal to us the notion that technological savvy, cryptographic savvy, and that ability to sort of run with these ideas and actually try to make noise about it may matter more than some of these traditional journalistic protections. But the story so far, in many ways, I think actually does look really good for journalism as we know it. So if the revelations themselves are somewhat unsurprising, if the relationship between a whistleblower and the mainstream press is somewhat unsurprising, where's the surprise? And for me, one of the big surprises has been this lack of public movement around this issue. There's been really good polling done by Pew over the last 2 years or so, trying to figure out how Americans have reacted to the Snowden revelations. And one of the things that's actually been very, very interesting, this is a comparison between the general public and the Council on Foreign Relations. It's not a huge surprise that the Council on Foreign Relations doesn't like these links. It is really interesting that 55% of Americans surveyed said that they think these leaks harm the public interest. And of course, what's really interesting around this is that this is happening at a time where we're having this sort of ongoing debate about what's the balance between civil rights and security. And that balance goes back and forth, and particularly at moments when people are really terrified, people are really scared, people are willing to balance strongly in favor of security over civil rights. And here's my theory on this. My theory is that, in part, we've had 20 years of training us not to expect this to be a surveillance-free space. We've had 20 years of companies essentially saying, if you're going to come online, if you're going to put content online, please expect that we're going to be collecting as much information on you as we can possibly do. And you should not expect these to be secure ways of transmitting information. In fact, if you look at what people think about how secure they feel using something like social media, sending a message on Facebook intended for one recipient, people will tell you they basically do not believe at all that they're going to find security in that. They don't necessarily like it. They're not thrilled about the fact that they're being surveilled on these systems. But they absolutely do not expect to have privacy in the way they expect to have privacy on a phone call when they come into these systems. And so what I want to talk about is basically how we got there. And I think the way we got there has everything to do with the ad model that we've embraced to make things possible on the internet. And I've been giving a talk. It's almost been sort of an apology tour this fall. I put out an article this summer in The Atlantic where I revealed my own sinister role in this, helping to create online advertising as we know it, including launching into the world the banner ad. And I've been doing this not just because I like self-flagellation and the look of shock on people's faces when they discover that someone who's apparently nice and mild-mannered as I might be has committed this crime against humanity. But I've been talking about it to talk about sort of how we ended up with this model. We've ended up with a model where we expect everything to be free online. And this was not necessarily an inevitable model. In 94, 95, people were looking at ways to charge for content. People were looking at ways for sort of restricting access to sites. But the technological framework simply wasn't there yet. It was incredibly difficult to process a credit card in 1995 when I started my first web firm, tripod.com. We did it, but it was just this awful system where it would show up on one screen, we would write it down on a slip of paper, we would type it in somewhere else. There was no security associated with it. And the notion that we were somehow going to do subscriptions for our content, inconceivable. Micropayment, even further down the road. Absolutely no way we were going to do it. The transaction costs were way too high. We knew that we really had two choices at that point. We could either do something like a traditional paper subscription. We would send you a bill and we would give you access to it. Remember, this is a point at which people were using America Online, and they would sign up for that and then actually pay for it and they would get access. Or we had to find a way to subsidize it and make it free. And the way that we subsidized it and made it free were these things, banner ads. And when we were selling banner ads way back in the mid-1990s, we had what sounded like a compelling pitch for them. If I'm selling you a banner ad in the 1990s, I could say things like, look at this. This is so much better than a magazine ad. It can be interactive, it can blink, it can flash, we can put movement in it. You can click on it and find out more about it. You can't do that with a billboard. You can't do that with a magazine ad. We can sell you more in this. At the end of the day, we might even be able to take you to a transaction. You might actually have an ad directly generating revenue, and we can give you all the information associated with this. Now, how much would you pay knowing that your ad could do that? And we went out and essentially said, we're going to charge for these what magazines charge for these ads. We're going to charge $35, $50, $75 for 1,000 of these. And we got that for about 6 weeks. And then suddenly everybody else figured out that they could get that, and then suddenly there was enormous price pressure, and suddenly we're down to about $25. And then we started realizing that actually very few people were clicking on these. And it turned out that that whole sort of performance basis actually put us in a very difficult position. We had to demonstrate that these ads actually did something. And of course, what we've learned subsequently is that human beings are really, really good at scanning through a page, paying no attention at all to the ad, and finding exactly where the content starts. And so we now have a world where we continue to use these things despite the fact that they don't work, nobody likes them, advertisers don't like them, publishers don't like them, but we use them because we are locked into a system where everybody expects this to be free, because that was the only thing we could figure out how to do in the mid-1990s. And of course, what we've really done with this is we've tried to figure out how to make them more and more effective, because they're not effective. And so you now have companies like Facebook that are not only trying to figure out how to monetize their free service by supporting it with ads, but they're taking the fact that you are revealing enormous amounts of information about yourself, who you're friends with, what your preferences are, and then going to advertisers and saying, okay, I know you don't like these, I know you don't think they do very well, but we're going to give you so much targeting information on your customer, you're going to have much more accurate data than you've had in any other sort of advertising that you would do. And we've ended up in an arms race. We have an escalating arms race of advertisers trying to find out more and more information about who we are, who we like, what we do, in the desperate hope that we can somehow create slightly better targeted ads that will get a slightly better click rate than anyone else gets on them. It's not going well. Even when you look at the sort of astronomical numbers associated with Facebook, the numbers are sort of crazy. Facebook captures something like 20 hours a month of our attention on average. And there are people here in this audience who spend way more than 20 hours a month on it, but on average, 20 hours a month of more than 1 billion users. What they're able to get from that is roughly 20 cents in revenue. Your time spent on Facebook for an hour is worth a penny to Facebook. Facebook is not bad at this. They are probably as good at this as anybody else in the world. They have hundreds of really, really talented people trying to figure out how to squeeze more information out of you, how to give a better profile to advertisers in the hopes that you glancing at that ad on the side will be slightly more valuable and that you might be slightly more inclined to click it. And despite that enormous human effort, they're able to get about a penny out of you a month. Interestingly enough, an attention minute is worth something like 10 times as much reading a print newspaper as it is reading something like Facebook. So when you actually look at what print newspapers are getting for ad revenue, they capture a great deal less of your time, and they get paid significantly more, to the point where it's about a 10-to-1 ratio, despite the fact that you can't click on that ad in print, you can't get any more information on this. So for me, I couldn't have a clearer proof that these things just don't work and that we need to find a way to start moving away from them. And that, of course, is not, in fact, what we're doing. What we're doing instead is finding more and more complicated and sinister ways to track people in online spaces. Probably everyone here understands that web browser cookies do not resemble these cookies. Many of us might understand that cookies are a way that sites try to keep some information on you so they can customize their content to you. In theory, the website doesn't remember who you are. If it has a cookie, it says, oh, you've read these pages, I'm going to put that on your front page the next time around. The cookies that have become very popular these days are called third-party cookies. And the idea is I'm looking at the New York Times, but I'm getting served a website from a completely different company, one of 1,900 advertising networks, who want to know that I visited the New York Times, because then they hope to find me on any number of other websites. And by associating my demographic profile with the sites that I have gone through, they have now generated a piece of marketable information that could be sold to an advertiser in the hopes of targeting one of these dreadful banner ads that does almost nothing slightly better than we currently target it. So we have entered into an economy where not only are the sites that are presenting us content surveilling our behavior and trying to get us to tell us more, but they're then telling many thousands of other sites, hey, he just came to see me, let me know if he comes to see you next, and then we'll know something about his psychographics, we attach to his demographics, and then maybe we can finally get him to click on that goddamn ad to put solar panels on his house. So this is the mainstream. This is the default of what happens on the web now. It's taken us about 20 years to get here, but this now shows up on most major social media and most major content websites. Now, there's ways to fight back against this. They're not easy to use. So the tools that Snowden used to communicate with Laura Poitras, these do a nice job of making you invisible to commercial surveillance. They do a pretty nice job of keeping you immune to government surveillance. A lot of that work relied on Tor. You guys may have been watching. The Tor network looks like it's been compromised in a very big, scary way. For those of us who work to defend human rights advocates, this is actually quite terrifying. We're very worried that there was a vulnerability that we didn't know about. But that wasn't actually what I wanted to talk about here. What I wanted to talk about is how few people use these tools. You could, in theory, if you wanted to protect yourself from certain types of surveillance, browse the web through Tor. You probably don't, because it's clunky and it's slow. And if you do, you're probably one of the 2 million daily users associated with this, most of whom are not in the US, most of whom are using Tor as a way of getting around national firewalls that prevent them from accessing certain content. But you might be part of that rare, less than 0.1% of total internet users. You might, and people in this room I would suspect probably are users of AdBlock. I'm a user of AdBlock, and put your hand up if you use it. You are now part of perhaps 1% of internet users. 21 million a day is what they advertise, out of about 2 billion at this point average web users online. And AdBlock does something fairly simple. It tries to block most of the ads from showing up on your website. It's probably a little bit unfair, a little bit asymmetric, ends up punishing the publishers that you're looking at. Doesn't actually do a ton in keeping you from this sort of tracking. Those sort of invisible third-party cookies, other web bugs are still collecting your information. It's a site called Ghostery that you can plug in. If you configure it certain ways, it'll block that information. They also claim about 20 million users. It's a very, very robust tool from the EFF called Privacy Badger that will try very, very hard to make sure that you're not giving up any of this information. It's got a whopping 150,000 people associated with it. People using these tools are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of web users. They're a tiny little fraction. And the truth is, many people feel like the level you would have to go to install these things and protect yourselves is such that they're trying sort of crazy, wacky solutions to this. Helen Nissenbaum has this amazing project that she's trying right now called Ad Nauseam. And Ad Nauseam incorporates a couple of these things. It incorporates ad block. You don't see any ads anymore. But what it does behind the scenes is it actually clicks every single ad, somehow in the hopes of crashing these ad networks by sort of generating more revenue for the sites that they live on by clicking every single ad. And of course, the problem is they're going to very quickly get blocked for fraud, but the hope is that enough people are using these, then suddenly ad networks are blocking everybody for fraud, and the whole sort of fraudulent nature of this economy becomes more and more visible. And if you wanted a sense for how much this frustrates people and how powerless they seem about it, think about the buzz that we saw about Ello. Ello showed up and said, look, we're going to build a very, very different sort of social media system. We're not going to track you. We're not going to have advertisers. Lots of debate back and forth about how serious they are, whether we can take them at their word. But the sheer fact that people crashed their invite system and that they created a months-long list of waiting for a beta to this gives you a sense that there is some sense that this isn't working very well. There's a lot of people who would love this idea of, can we find a way to support a social network without tracking us, but don't love it enough that they're going through the work right now trying to figure out how to instrument themselves to be immune from surveillance. And so what I want to ask in all of this is, what does this pervasive surveillance do to us? What does it do to us psychologically? What does it do to us as individuals within a society? And what's interesting is people are trying all sorts of different metaphors to explain this. And of course, the one that's become most popular is talking about Big Brother. And the issue with Orwellian 1984-style surveillance is that it actually isn't a very good description of what's going on. You know, what happens in Orwell's remarkable book is that the surveillance, first of all, it isn't targeted at everybody. It's targeted at this sort of small set of party elites. Orwell's an incredible elitist. Like, he doesn't care about the proles at all. He really cares about the people who are sort of writing and reading books, and he's really interested in the ways that they might be directly confronted and controlled by Big Brother. So Orwell looks like the right analogy because there's the omnipresent screen. We're all surrounded by screens right now. We've started to learn that the screens are watching us. But in Orwell, the screens are talking to you. And they're watching you in this very personal fashion. There's someone from the thought police trying to make sure that you specifically are not straying out of line, and they're going to confront you in a very, very personal fashion if you're committing thought crime. It's tempting to sort of play with the analogy. It just doesn't map very well. This sort of surveillance system that we're looking at doesn't seem to care very much what you think unless you stray into these particular categories of possible terrorist. But most of the system is not a government system. Most of the system is a commercial system that really just wants to know who you are and what you like. And so people have started playing with other metaphors for this. Is this in fact the Panopticon? So this is a proposed design for a prison by Jeremy Bentham. It's always good to be reminded that Bentham was a prison reformer. Like, he was trying to do the right thing. He had an idea for more humane prisons. And the reason we know about this is that Michel Foucault sort of took apart this idea in Discipline and Punish and played with this as what he saw as a very contemporary means of surveillance. And the way that surveillance worked was there might or might not be a guard in that guard tower. Your cell was open to being viewed from the guard tower. And so because you knew you might be viewed at some point, you would control your own behavior. And this is the aspect of the Panopticon that is probably the most profound. It's not that you have to be watched at all times. It's that the Panopticon has the possibility of you being watched. And the possibility of you being watched is enough for you to shape your own behavior. You become the one who disciplines yourself. You are the one who turns yourself into a model prisoner, a model factory worker, because Foucault extends this and basically says this shows up in sort of all aspects of the 20th century. And once again, this doesn't quite get what's going on here. We see it a little bit when we think about something like private browsing. We're basically accepting when we go into Safari and we sort of say, put me in private browsing. Don't keep track of what I'm doing. Turn off the Panopticon for a moment. The first thing that we're doing is we're sort of accepting that we really are under that perpetual surveillance. But we're also at the same time realizing how limited our ability to step out of it actually is. Private browsing simply keeps the record of what you're looking out of your own browser. It's a nice way to sort of deal with being disciplined by yourself or perhaps being disciplined by your spouse. It doesn't actually release you from any of these sort of broader forms of surveillance. And in some ways, what it actually should be is this sort of reminder that it's simply going on at all times. But I think the reason that Foucaultian surveillance doesn't really help us is the answer is we don't really find ourselves disciplined by these systems. We don't find ourselves actually changing our behavior. We are highly aware that surveillance occurs within these systems. We say that we're not comfortable with it. But in fact, the advertisers are trying very, very hard not to get us to change our behavior. In fact, if we are changing our behavior in reaction to being surveilled, we're not helpful to them anymore. We're starting to put up a false data self, a different representation of ourselves than the one that they actually want to sell or market to. But what's interesting, of course, is these have become very popular ways of looking at it. I'm just comparing Orwell versus Panopticon over the time afterwards. It's actually Panopticon is on the rise, Orwell is on the fall in all of this. I think neither of these actually give us the accurate picture where we want to look at. And so I want to use this term, the surveilled assemblage. And this is a term put forward by Kevin Haggerty, Richard Erickson. It builds on the work of Gallus and Felix Guattari. And what it is a vision of surveillance that's so pervasive that you have to give it almost an organic metaphor. They talk about the rhizomal nature of surveillance. And so what I put up was Armillaria sulpides, which is in fact one of the largest organisms on the planet. There is a set of these mushrooms in Washington that now occupies a 3.4 square mile area. If you were to knock down any of the fruiting bodies of this, the rhizomes under the forest floor are simply going to plop up again. And this is what these two thinkers, Haggerty and Erickson, mean by a surveilled assemblage. It's not a single person watching you. It's not a single technology like the Panopticon. It's all sorts of different technologies being combined into this coherent assemblage that's watching you. And they see this as a really elegant way of explaining how surveillance has come online in the era of PRISM. It's not just that there's a database tracking what websites you visit, maintained by one company, or that there's another database of whether you've shown up on a particular CCTV. It's the ability to put all those databases together. And when you start dealing with the surveillance assemblage, it becomes difficult to draw a line between commercial surveillance and government surveillance. And in fact, that's exactly what we've seen with PRISM. At a certain point, it doesn't matter who's surveilling you, because if you can combine that information, if you have the legal framework that makes it possible to combine that information, private surveillance can become part of that larger surveillance assemblage whenever it's helpful. And so for me and for many people, this was the most uncomfortable part of the NSA revelations, was this discovery that a form of surveillance we had essentially opted into was now being used against us. We knew anyone who was smart enough to understand how a service like Gmail ran understood that they were reading your emails in plain text so they could target ads to them. Anytime you've gotten those uncomfortable little ads, in the side, trying to figure out how to target an ad to you. My favorite on this, by the way, is I work in my free time for Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros's charitable arm. So I get a lot of emails from Gmail that talk about George Soros and the occasional email from George Soros. And then in the right column on my Gmail, I get buy investing tips from George Soros. George Soros wants to go long on this stock, and sort of diving into this. And it's this very basic, primitive form of surveillance, but it is so far how Gmail has chosen to run. And we've opted into it. I had a choice of running my own email, doing any number of different ways of doing email. I could be using RiseUp, but I'm using Gmail. And I've opted into the surveillance as part of that business model. It's fairly obvious that that sort of surveillance, that sort of system, could be opened up and become part of a government system. But the notion of the surveillance assemblage is you don't notice these things are interconnected until it's too late, until you're at a moment where you're suddenly under this very intense surveillance. And what the authors end up sort of talking about is the notion that what happens within a surveillance assemblage is the disappearance of disappearance. You no longer have the possibility of saying, I'm going to be in a surveillance-free space now. They basically point out that if you want to be surveillance-free at this point, you should start by not working, not using the internet, not owning a mobile phone, now post-NSA probably not making any phone calls, given the instrumentation of many of the cities that we're in, preferably never going outside. And so at a certain point, you start looking at this and essentially saying, okay, I give up, I get it. I'm living under a condition where someone is going to be surveilling me at all times. I now have to think about what I want to do about that. One of the interesting things about the internet is that we began with an assumption that this was going to be a surveillance-free space. This is an early and very famous New Yorker cartoon celebrating this idea that on the internet, you don't have to be who you are in physical space. And this was an idea that was incredibly popular in the early years of the internet, sort of the pre-web internet, the late 1980s, early 1990s. There were all sorts of theoretical pieces written by people like Shelley Turkle about how the net was going to be this space for identity play. We could become whoever we wanted to be. We could put on a different persona. I could try out what it would mean to be female or to be Latino or to be any other sort of identity. And we have very quickly lost that as an assumption. Now, first of all, that was never a very good assumption. I got a wonderful sort of reminder of this in 1992 when the Secret Service raided the computer lab that I was sitting in at Williams College because the guy who had the terminal next to mine was an anarchist named Brian Cohen who had written in an anonymous Usenet post, "Bush and his people need a bullet." And 2 days later, we had Secret Service agents who were concerned about the fact that this national from the Netherlands with a gun permit had written anonymously, "Bush needed a bullet." But it was a very interesting moment for all of us in that computer lab sort of going, well, that was fast. Like, they worked that out pretty darn quickly. And so again, like this notion that the net was not as anonymous as many of us had thought is not news. But the notion that we've given it up as the default, the notion that we no longer believe that this is a space where we could enter anonymously and interact or put on a different identity or try on a different face is something I actually want to think about what we're losing when we make that concession. So I want to make this argument that in the era of the surveillance assemblage, there is no escaping it. There is no place without surveillance. And I want to ask a slightly different question, which is, do we have an option not to be part of that assemblage? So if we can't avoid surveillance, can we avoid surveilling? So here's Global Voices. I've been helping run this website for about 10 years. I've loaded this onto a Chrome browser while running Ghostery. And Ghostery is this little plugin that lets you sort of find out what websites are getting called up when you call up this website. So when I'm calling up Global Voices, these images, all of these posts, is this on? Are you doing this?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. When we call this up, almost everything on this website is coming off of Global Voices. You're visiting Global Voices. You expect the content to be coming from Global Voices. You're getting some content from two different sites here. You're getting some content from Adobe Typekit, which is a tool a lot of graphic designers now use to lay out their type more elegantly, and we're pulling some resources off of Adobe's server. And you're getting some resources from the Google Analytics platform. Like almost everybody else in the world, we run Google Analytics because we want to show our funders how many people are looking at our content. Look, please give us money. Hundreds of thousands of people actually looked at this. So that's what happens when you load up our site. Some really different things happen when you go to The Guardian to read about surveillance. And I picked The Guardian advisedly here, but this seemed like a fair critique to point out. The Guardian is drawing on 40 or 50 other sites when they're rendering this page. In some cases, they're drawing on these sites because that's where the content is. So that ad is coming from someone else's web server. It's the web server of an ad company. And they're somewhere in that list of AdTech, Advertising.com, Aggregate Knowledge, AppNexus, Audience Science, Burst Media, BuySite, Criteo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what's happening with most of those is that you've got a web bug, which is to say you have a little 1 pixel by 1 pixel invisible image. It loads from that other person's website. They now have the information that you visited The Guardian. They store that information. They check to see what other websites you've been to. They add it to your psychographic profile, what they have out on the web. Certain of these are more powerful than others. Adobe has an analytics product called Omniture. Omniture claims that not only can it tell you with pretty good certainty who you are, it can also tell recent search queries you've put through, recent behavior on social media. And what they're basically advertising is not only can I help you know this person as a customer, I can help you know what they're saying about your brand, if they are in fact saying anything. Now this is pretty interesting. The Guardian is not doing this because The Guardian is Big Brother. The Guardian is not doing this because they somehow want to discipline you into some sort of web behavior. The Guardian is doing this because they have a really challenging problem, which is they need to deliver you this content, and they would really prefer not to charge you for it. Because if they want it to have civic impact, if they want it to actually have impact on you, how you vote, how you make decisions, it's really important that it have a wide reach. And so having it accessible to everybody is a really, really good thing. But to make that possible, the only model that we figured out thus far is targeted advertising. And so they have an enormous incentive to put as many of these things on the page as possible. These things aren't cost-free, by the way. They actually make the page load very slowly. If you sort of watch a page load on a major media site, you'll see most of the content come up, and depending on how slow your connection is, you can watch for another 5 or 10 seconds. Those are all the web bugs loading in and trying to figure out how to send that information sort of back and forth. So The Guardian is very much part of this surveillance system. And understandably so. It's hard to figure out how you posit a revenue model for The Guardian that doesn't have some sort of participation in what has in the last 20 years become the mainstream way that we pay for content online. But I do want to suggest that there's other ways to do this. So I'm really interested in this idea of creating surveillance-free spaces, both in the physical world and in the digital world. And I think the idea that a surveillance-free space is a bit Orwellian is actually sort of part of the point behind it. I'm inspired by the notion of designated free speech areas that have started showing up at protests in the United States as a way of both saying, we acknowledge that under the First Amendment, you have a right to stand here and hold a sign, unless you're directly in front of the Supreme Court, in which case, screw you. But we're going to create a designated area so that you don't, God forbid, prevent the normal functioning of the Republican National Convention, for instance. And so you have these areas being sort of set aside as this will be a place where the First Amendment will be honored and you will be able to protest. If you think about it, we have these areas. They're called libraries. And it's really interesting to see the extent to which librarians have recognized that libraries need to be a surveillance-free space. Libraries have wonderful possible incentives. I'm sure there are many companies out there that would love to track people's book borrowing behavior and to try to figure out how to target ads to it. But libraries decided a long, long time ago that it is really, really important that your relationship with your librarian be like your relationship with your lawyer or your doctor. It is a secret that librarians are going to go to a very, very long degree to protect, precisely so the young Alison Bechdel can go into a library and say, I wonder what homosexuality is. I think that might be relevant to me and my interests, without fear that her small community was going to somehow react to this. So librarians have been amazing on this. You see librarians do things like being the active folks who stand up and fight gag orders against national security letters. And so in fact, probably the leading experts right now on fighting a national security letter that demands information about how people have used computers at your facility are 4 librarians who successfully fought off a gag order and are now 4 of the only people in the United States who are able to talk about it. You see librarians, like this is a sign from Jessamine West, essentially saying, under a gag order, I cannot tell you if our records have been accessed. But what I can do in the meantime is hang up a sign that says the FBI has not been here and urge you to pay attention to that sign, because if you ever see that sign go down, that would be a moment at which you should probably know that it did not in fact go down by accident. So libraries are taking some quite aggressive steps to work on being surveillance-free zones. Libraries are starting to publish best practices which have to do with destroying borrower records as soon as a book is returned. And the reason for that is that then the record is not subpoenaable. So you can't go back in and discover my long history of buying, bomb-making books in my hopes of finally taking down Yankee Stadium. God damn it, I'm going to get it done before the end of my career. Because those records will no longer be there. You have some libraries in Massachusetts working with the ACLU to install Tor on web browsers so that people can come into a public civic space and have a space that is not just a physical space free of surveillance, but a digital space free of surveillance. Do I think that this is the solution to surveillance? No, I don't. I think the notion of the surveillance assemblage has gone far enough that it's really difficult to sort of step out of that sort of surveillance. But I think this notion of fencing off an area and essentially saying, this is really important, we need to have this be a surveillance-free space so that a library can fill its civic function, is incredibly powerful and incredibly provocative. And it really forces us to think about the rest of the world and the ways that surveillance operates there, and think about, are we comfortable with this being one of our few surveillance-free spaces? And what I want to end with is with a challenge, which is to say, it's incredible that The Guardian, that The Washington Post have put legal resources, reporting resources, behind making sure that we know these revelations coming out of the Snowden document leak, that we understand them, that we see the implications of them. It's enormously civically important. But I think it's time for newspapers and news-gathering organizations to ask themselves whether they want to be part of that assemblage that is slowly convincing us all that there is in fact no escape from surveillance, or whether they want to take the principled stand of trying to figure out, can you create a space to gain civic information where you are free of that surveillance in one fashion or another? I think it's time for newspapers to take a real look at this question of whether they should also try to find a way to become those surveillance-free spaces. If they don't, I offer a much gentler suggestion, which I'm in the process of writing, which is I think The Guardian should provide a reader's guide to safely reading The Guardian on surveillance without being surveilled. And so for the essay that I'll be turning in for this book, I will be giving you roughly this talk, as well as a brief, helpful, illustrative user guide, which will be released under Creative Commons. And so if The Guardian or anyone else wants to release it as a way of helping people safely read their comment as a public service, that will be available as well. Thank you for listening.
We've got time, I think, for some Q&A. anyone who has questions raise their hand, say, I have something you've got to ask. We'll take as many questions as we can.
And it's always nice to introduce yourself, so please step on up to the mic, introduce yourself, ask a question, and I'll do my best.
And if you can do it with the microphone, even better, because that keeps you in the light.
We are surveying you, we're live streaming you, so you're certainly part of the assemblage here. So-
My name's Fergus Pitt. I work for the Tow Centre. Your discussion about how media companies surveil people was very much on the business side, and for a lot of journalists it's easy to say, oh, that's the business side. As well, journalists are beginning to use increasingly sophisticated ways of gathering data in their reporting.
Yes.
How restrained should we be? What are our concerns? Who should be our targets, or not?
So a great observation and then great question. On the observation side of this, I think this is a place where the firewall between business and reporting is much more permeable than we think. And I think it's fairly easy as a journalist to sort of say, no, my job isn't to keep the publication going, my job is to get the story out. But my point on the nature of surveillance right now is that there really isn't a good line between state surveillance and commercial surveillance. And that commercial surveillance is likely to become part of state surveillance at some time. And in the same way that we've seen governments subpoena library records, we've seen them subpoena video watching records, it's going to become routine fairly soon to subpoena people's web behavior coming from these tracking systems. So I don't actually think we can draw that line cleanly. I do think you're raising an incredibly important question, which is that as we start using these big data reporting techniques, as we start combining large databases, there's a whole set of other privacy concerns that sort of come out from this. One of the things that we're discovering is that while these data sets are enormously powerful, enormously interesting, they're also enormously hard to anonymize. And so there's been quite an interesting recent stretch of work from what's called the de-anonymization community around this set of New York City taxi data. So New York City released a year's worth of taxi data, fare data, where the cabs were going, said that they had carefully anonymized it. Different scholars have been de-anonymizing different pieces of it. So in the first wave of this, it became possible to find out what a given taxi driver earns in a given year, which was sort of interesting, but potentially challenging for those people who were matched up with their medallions. In the most recent version, someone has figured out how to use this to identify people who have attended certain strip clubs regularly in the New York City area. Because it turns out that if you look for the Hustler Club, which is really one of the very few things on that block, and it turns out that someone in your building has made 7 trips there, you are perhaps either a frequent patron or, even more concerning, an employee there, which suddenly turns this into a stalking tool. Where people have sort of come up with this is this sense of simply releasing these databases and having people have sort of unlimited access to it, which is really fun from the perspective of munging data, is probably really dangerous in many circumstances. And so a lot of people are sort of thinking about, can we set this up so that you can query this data, but only in ways that are going to make it impossible to sort of identify individuals out of the set? I think we're going through this brief period of time where we're directly working with data sets, where people are sort of getting really big data sets, analyzing them, pulling very interesting reporting out of them. For those people who are doing this ethically, enjoy it while it lasts. I don't think it's going to work that way in another 10 years. I actually think it's going to be very, very difficult to release data sets that way. I think most of them are going to be accessed remotely via APIs that make it difficult to make certain privacy revealing calls. In the meantime, I think we can do a lot of work on sort of codes of ethics around this, where we basically say, we recognize that it's quite possible to de-anonymize this data and reveal personal information out of this. We need to think about this notion of contextual privacy. What were the expectations of privacy that person expected when they revealed that data? And are we using that data in a way that is violating those expectations? I'm stealing that definition from Helen Nissenbaum, who I think has done some of the best thinking on the topic. I don't see most newsrooms having that discussion yet of what happens when we head there. I think we need to have it because it would be really nice if this was sort of best practice in the field rather than something that we end up sort of having hand slapped for in the long run. Please.
Hi, Lucia Hoffman, and I'm a student here, and great presentation. And the Town Center and the Brown Institute, they offer us this semester some workshops, with Chris and Karen. It was really great because, as a journalist, there are a lot of things I didn't know. So my question to you is there are, Tor out there and, AdBlock, but how can we make sure that people will know about those services? Because, a lot of people, they want the privacy, but they don't know it's there. And my second question is, at the end, because then they will have all the information, how can we trust them?
So, sorry, just on the second one, make sure I understand.
Do they
How
keep
we,
the information also? Because,
on something like Tor?
Yeah, like for
Okay.
Tor, 2 million people.
Right.
So,
Yep.
how can you trust? It's like changing a government in a way, but
Right.
the trust is...
So let me start with that one, and then let me get into the answer to the first question.
Sure.
So a system like Tor is interesting to us because architecturally, they don't know who we are. So there's two ways to sort of build what's called a proxy system. If I access a web server directly, I go to the Tau Center's web server. Emily, because this is what she does in her free time, it's what's on her phone right now, just reads her server logs. She sees that I've logged onto it. She's watching me log on. She's surveilling me in real time. If I want to find another way to access that web server, I use a proxy. I go to another computer and I say, hey, computer, would you mind going to the Tau Center, getting me that page, because I don't want Emily to see that I'm getting it. The problem in that case is that I'm trusting that other web server, and that's really the question that you're asking. Tor does something very, very clever. It actually uses a random sequence of 3 computers, and then it encrypts the request between all of them. So unless you've somehow managed to guess all 3 computers, you're not going to be able to figure out where I was going and that I was going there. And the administrators of Tor can't figure it out as well, which is actually what's interesting about it. It's a much higher level of security than we see in most tools. It's what people call secure by design. You're architecting it in such a way that even if you come under subpoena, you don't have information to reveal. But this takes me to my first question, which is surveillance needs to be a beat. And it needs to be a beat not just in terms of what's going on at the government level. Will this piece of legislation that's in the Senate right now get passed? Is it strong enough? Is it too weak? But it also needs to be a consumer protection beat. It would be great to see The Guardian or other great newspapers looking at this and not just publishing this sort of fanciful guide that I've put forward about reading The Guardian safely, but essentially saying, look, here are the places in which you may be leaking information that you are not aware of. Here are some of the options that you might use to sort of get around that. The question that you asked is absolutely on point. About 20 million people are using Ghostery. Ghostery is a pretty good tool to keep you out of these ad networks, but they are also selling aggregate statistics on who is opting out of those ad networks. So exactly that. You are trusting Ghostery to be anonymizing your data and sort of selling that. Privacy Badger, which almost no one is using because it's a kind of a brute force tool, says that they're not doing that at all, and the hope is that we can review their code, we can make sure that they aren't in fact doing that. But this is really hard for ordinary civilians, but this is the essence of what public service journalism is about. It's essentially saying, here is how you are encountering this space, here are things that are happening to you and with your data that you may not be aware of, here's how to understand this in plain English, and here are ways that you could take steps if this is something that concerns you. So my hope on this is that people don't just take as a lesson from Snowden that they have to get their OPSEC, their operational security, good enough that they can deal with whistleblowers and sources. We absolutely need to do that. But we also need to think about how to let people in on this larger space of surveillance and help them understand it by covering it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi. Thank you for your lecture. It's really great. So I've been Googling, my name's Jane Goldberg. I've been Googling Snowden and Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald every night since the story broke. And I'm just wondering, like when you write to First Look at The Intercept, and they give you Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept, and then they also give you all this encryption.
Yep.
Does he get your emails if you just write Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept because he's being so protective of himself now? Or do you have to use all those numbers, and how do you use them?
Sure.
That's first question.
So do you want to give me the second question as
Yeah,
well?
please.
I can queue.
Okay. Good.
I keep a cache.
What's the difference between was Julian Assange doing encryption? Okay. What's the difference between Seymour Hersh's protecting his sources? Is he like irrelevant now, or does he, because he would never tell people who told him?
Yep.
But obviously he was being surveilled, right?
Yep.
And I guess the third question is, this we probably can't answer, but did Snowden go to Hong Kong because of surveillance issues? I mean, did he think he was going to be freer? I mean, I know he went because he thought he'd get a fairer deal there. So those are three
Sure.
questions.
So let me try to back my way out of this. I have no idea why Snowden went to Hong Kong, and I'm not
Okay.
even going to speculate because it
Okay.
would just be a waste of everyone's time here because
Okay.
I don't have any information you don't have.
I read a lot about it. No one saw me
on
read
this
it.
on this question of Cy Hirsch, I don't think Cy Hirsch is ever irrelevant. I don't think that style of journalism is ever irrelevant. What I do think is critically important is sort of understanding that when Cy Hirsch has a source, there are two ways that he can be compromised. He can be compromised by telling law enforcement who he's talking to. And I don't think Cy's going to do that. He's got a pretty good track record on that one. But he can also be compromised by someone looking at his communications and saying, oh, this is really interesting. Cy dials 413-499-4565 pretty darn often before he writes this story. I wonder who's got that mobile phone number. And that's the place where reporters really need help. So this brings us over to First Look. I don't know if Glenn reads his own email. My guess is he's a pretty busy guy. He doesn't read all of it himself. There's probably someone helping him with it. My guess is that if you send an encrypted email, it probably does get a bit more attention, simply in as much as right now it's a fairly uncommon thing to do. It suggests that you put a bit more time and thought into it. Mm-hmm. Those numbers that you're seeing are basically a way of looking up Glenn's private key. And if you use a tool called PGP, you'll be able to retrieve his key. You'll be able to send an email that at that point only he or whoever is holding that key can read. For someone who doesn't do a lot in this space, what I would actually suggest is start by looking at a program called Mailvelope. Mailvelope is a really nice, easy to use implementation of PGP that works well with webmail, which is what most people are using these days. But the real point in this is that within First Look Media, there's a guy named Morgan Makibore, who is one of the 100 leading crypto and digital security guys in the world. And he was one of the people that they hired really early on in the process to basically be there for their reporters to say, how do we get the right level of security between a source and a reporter, and how do we continually audit ourselves against security threats? So this is a guy who went directly out of Google's security team. I happen to know him pretty well, and I wrote one of the recommendation notes for his O1 visa, trying to make the case that this is one of the very few people in the world, and therefore has to have an extraordinary visa to do this. And it was a really easy letter to write. Major news organizations are going to need to bring those people on, because you can't just have Cy these days. You also need Morgan. You need someone looking to try to figure out how to secure that channel. Those people are in very, very short supply because the work is very, very, very hard. I think it's really impressive that First Look has made that commitment to it. I think if you're this interested in these issues, this would be a great time to learn how to use PGP. Start with Mailvelope, see where you go from there, and I suspect there are other people around this building who could help you with it as
Is
well.
public key the same as private key? When they say public key.
So here's the crazy thing about how encryption works. I can post my public key out on the web. You can find it. It's on a web server at MIT. You can send a message using my public key, and I will be the only person who's able to read it. To read it, I have to use my private key, which lives on my hard drive, is protected by a very strong passphrase. But you can publish that public key anywhere, and there's no way to decipher the message based on the public key. So it's a fairly incredible thing as far as a technological achievement, but that's how it works. We've got to go to the lady behind you.
Hi, thank you very much for your words. My name is Janina Zagnini. I'm a visiting professor here. And I have a question about the future. Well, it could be about the present as well. I've been thinking a lot about, all these problems and surveillance and what's happening to us and what could happen in the future. If you think about it now, there are a bunch of teenagers out there who will be the future world leaders in, 30 to 40 years from now. And they have been, all their information since they were born is being stored somewhere. So now we think, or we want to think, that Google and Facebook and all these guys are just working on, using our data for commercial purposes. But what if they decide to do other stuff, like controlling the world? I know it could seem like paranoid, but why not? Who's gonna keep these guys accountable? There's no government in the world, I've been thinking about it, who can control Google. If they decide to move on and start to do other stuff besides the commercial thing that we. Mm-hmm.
So you just outlined the plot of a recent book called The Circle, which I can't actually recommend to you because it's really sexist and kind of predictable, but it is kind of a fun read, and it's exactly about that, and it's basically a company that is like Google merged with Facebook that controls all the world's information and discovers that by finding secrets in everybody's past, they can basically blackmail every politician into the future. Couple of things that I want to just sort of poke at slightly while agreeing with you most of the way. What's really interesting is that on the one hand, we're storing immeasurable amounts of information. There are at least 1,000 companies out there that have some version of my traces through the web every day. And so they probably have a rough sense of what I'm searching for and what I read regularly and so on and so forth. At the same time, we're actually really dreadful at archiving. And so stuff that people write disappears at a somewhat frightening rate. And there are actually a lot of historians sort of looking at the early 21st century and sort of saying, we're going to have a really tough time of this because people don't write paper journals anymore. They write on blogs or they write on Facebook. And when those things become inaccessible, they just disappear altogether. There aren't like the notebooks that we can go and sort of get in your office. They're just gone. I think on balance, you're probably right. And I think the way to think about it is not just in terms of what happens if Google decides that they want this person to be president. I think it's actually worth sort of thinking about what happens when this generation has sort of grown up expecting that this digital public sphere, this space in which we argue and we explore and we investigate, is a fully surveilled space. Are we going to end up with people who are incredibly cautious because they've been used to creating this sort of public persona all the time? Are they going to be incredibly narcissistic and voyeuristic because they've grown up on this sort of Snapchat culture? You can write best-selling books arguing either of those. I don't think anyone has a sense for what the answer is going to be, but I would say that it's probably going to be a pretty profound effect on how we think about how we write, how we communicate, what it means to be a citizen. Where I would want to go with your question is essentially say, why do we feel so powerless over this? This stuff is 20 years old. The web as we know it was invented 25 years ago. Most of us didn't possibly notice it until 1994. That's where you get the first commercial web browser. I started building commercial websites and surveillance systems, by the way, in 1994. I'm still working in this space. The people who built this stuff, almost all, still work in this space. And if we individually or collectively sort of decided this is not a good way to go, we could start thinking about different ways to do this. I totally sympathize with your question, but the one thing that I want to sort of point to is that we tend to talk about this stuff as if it's a natural law. You know, things fall to the floor when I drop them. But the web doesn't naturally have to be ad-supported. It doesn't naturally have to surveil you. And things happen all the time where they become technologically possible, and we decide that they are not societally desirable. And what's happened is that Silicon Valley has done such a good job of persuading Americans that we can't compete in any other realm. There is no other innovation other than in the digital. So therefore, please do not get in our way and regulate us in any way. And for the most part, we've sort of sat there and said, yeah, that sounds right. We wouldn't want to screw things up. This would be a fine time for a group like the FTC to sort of look at things and say, maybe this isn't okay. Maybe there shouldn't be 50 ad trackers when you try to read the goddamn newspaper. And maybe this is time for the public as a whole to sort of say, I know you guys think this is the best way to make money, but this isn't acceptable, and we're going to have to find out a better compromise on this. But that would require a political movement, and a political movement probably requires reporting on something like Snowden, not just from the perspective of, look at this fascinating guy who gave up his life in Hawaii and his exotic dancer girlfriend to run off to Russia. Isn't that fascinating that someone would do this? And actually reporting it from the perspective of how much surveillance have we let into our lives, and who should be regulating this, and who is asking for this to happen. Sorry, I think that was a rant instead of an answer. I think I have some strong feelings on this subject.
Question. Actually, it's how to keep, these guys accountable. Who? Who's the person? Is there such a thing? A government or a civil movement? Or
So, in the US, you'd probably use the FTC. I don't think anyone expects that to happen. I think even with President Obama finally making a move on net neutrality, it's been hard to see anyone making reasonable moves on surveillance. What most of us are hoping for right now is what people are referring to as the Brasilia-German alliance, which is to say that Brazil and Germany were the two countries that got the most incensed by the NSA revelations. They're two countries that are big enough and economically powerful enough that you can't ignore them. And Germany in particular has been very good about putting strong privacy regulations and protections forward. So the theory had been, well, if we can win court cases in the EU, if we can win new policies in Brazil, maybe a company like Google will change their behavior globally. What's happening, unfortunately, is that they're now just starting to treat the EU as a special case. And this is what's happened with the right to forget decision. Google now has a special set of tools and procedures for EU countries around right to forget, but is not implementing those same protections, and they may not be the right protections. But one way or another, right to forget has sort of demonstrated that thus far, pressure from Germany, pressure from Brazil, isn't going to change these services at their core. So it probably does actually require a US movement. Please.
Hi, my name is Danielle Thompson. I work in product development, and I'm a lecturer at NYU Poly. But I have a question. I've noticed a lot of times that most Americans, the only kind of access or titles in the media that they hear about anonymity or like surveillance-free spaces are usually in like nefarious contexts, like a deep web and Tor and Silk Road and Jennifer Lawrence naked and all of this kind of thing. And the mainstream media hasn't done a really good job of really promoting these spaces as alternative, like good spaces, right? So most of America then kind of views anonymity as this dark thing. What does the mainstream media and media generally have as like a duty to promote these spaces instead of making them seem like bad boys?
So I love the sneer that you got when you said Tor. It just, it warms my heart as a longtime Tor user and advocate and supporter and advisor. But you're absolutely right. So what this really comes down to is that all these tools are dual purpose, right? So strong encryption, encrypted email, is a really good way to conduct drug deals. And if we get to a place that I would like to get, which is that strongly encrypted email is the norm rather than an exceptional case, it's probably going to make it easier for that to be a highly secured channel for nefarious activities. The flip side is that right now, when it's not the norm, it's actually pretty dangerous for the people that I work with who are dissidents in nations with repressive governments to use these tools. And so, in fact, what happens when you go into Egypt, and this is now under Mubarak, not that the new Egypt is all that different from the old Egypt, but you go and you work with a group like the Egyptian Institute for Personal Rights, which is basically the gay and lesbian lobby within Egypt. I used to go to this organization and provide trainings on PGP and Tor. And I would go in and I would come back 6 months later and I would say, are you guys using PGP and Tor? And they would say, no. I'd say, do you need another training? I'd be happy to show you again. I brought all the tools. I'll walk you through it. And finally, the very polite director of this organization said, did you walk past anyone when you walked up the stairs into our office? And I said, yeah, there were like 9 guys on the stairs. They're wearing leather jackets. They just seem to be hanging out. He said, yeah, they're waiting to talk to me about what you and I talked about when you leave my office. That's all state security. And they're all going to come in and talk to me about what we talked about in this, and I'll figure out how to talk about what we talked about and reveal some and not others. If I encrypt my email, I am basically waving a red flag in front of those guys instead of saying I have something to hide. So encryption needs to happen by default. And we're slowly but surely getting there, right? So Facebook was sort of the last big holdout on the social network sites. Everybody else has kind of figured out that we should have HTTPS access to these sites. You actually want to encrypt the traffic between your computer and Facebook or your computer and Twitter because you don't want it to look weird that someone is saying, ooh, I'm doing an encrypted connection to Facebook so I can send my super secret Facebook messages so that Tunisian security will now come and talk to me. What happens when we talk about Tor and the dark web, which is a great story. Come on, it's a really sexy story. It's crazy that someone's figured out a way to sell heroin online using Bitcoin and using the dark web. I'd want to run that story. But if that's the only story we run, we turn strong encryption into something that criminals use. And the answer is strong encryption is something that everybody should use. I don't like people reading my mail. Therefore, I put it in envelopes rather than writing it on postcards. Similarly, I encrypt a lot of my email with people for whom I know that it's not going to be an obstacle because I'd like to make that a normal standard. Until we find a way to cover not just the dissidents, because I don't think you can actually balance out all of those dark web stories with 2 or 3 heartwarming Egyptian blogger stories. I think what we actually need is basically a conversation about, shouldn't this just be what we expect? So I'm going to invoke Helen for the 3rd time in this talk. Go read Helen Nissenbaum. She's amazing. She basically says, look, it's not about an absolute right to privacy. What it is about is what your expectations are and whether those expectations are challenged. We treat email as a private communications medium. If you send me an email and I forward it to Emily without your permission, I violated a trust. I've broken a norm. But email, as it runs in most companies, is completely reviewable by the corporation, by the HR department, by the president. That's probably not how we should build this. We should probably build email systems that actually are encrypting the channel between the two of us so that the technology represents the norm that we're also following. Or we should change the norm. And we should basically say, no, it's a corporate email. Expect that everyone's going to read it. Don't put anything in the email that you wouldn't want out of it. And then at least it lines up with the norms. That's where we could really use good reporting on this, is helping people understand that what really has to happen with this is that this has to become mainstream, this has to become completely quotidian. Otherwise, it ends up being really unsafe for the people who are using it and who really need it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I actually just want to ask one last question, which came from
Please.
one of the developers, actually at The Guardian, who said, this sounds like a great idea, but how can we do this? Is it possible to do this whilst at the same time not tracking for all of the things that we track for to improve
Yeah.
access to journalism?
Yeah.
Which again is your question about where does this sit in a commercial space or a user
Yeah.
improvement space? Can we actually make things better without tracking people?
So I haven't analyzed The Guardian well enough yet to say, of those 50,
You're openly invited to do
please,
so.
please shut off those
Yeah.
40.
Right.
And the reason I did this in a very deliberate fashion, right? So I showed up with my site to show you what I'm tracking and where I'm invoking third-party cookies, because it does happen, and sometimes it makes sense to do. I think Google Analytics makes sense. It's a really good idea to have a sense of who's looking at your pages. I'm not hugely worried about that. But within that set of things, I think particularly cross-site tracking, and particularly the more aggressive bugs that are trying to sort of correlate your behavior on social media. And essentially what they're trying to figure out is they're trying to link your profile to your Twitter account or your Facebook account in the hope of de-anonymizing. That strikes me as a very poor idea. I'm certainly not saying stop tracking your users. I'm not even saying stop doing A/B testing or doing interface testing or so on and so forth. What I am saying is that right now, my relationship with The Guardian, the conversation I am having with a newspaper that I choose to read, is being shared with 50 companies I know nothing about. And I think The Guardian probably has some obligation to say to me, here's why I chose to share that conversation with them, and possibly make it possible for me to basically say, I'd like to shut down some of it. For your developer, I think where this really comes down is I can block all of it. You know, I can put up, Privacy Badger and run the damn thing through Tor, and I can advocate for others to do it, and then you're going to have very little ability to track me at all. I think it would be much more valuable to have this conversation, which is really at the publisher level, that essentially says, are we doing too much of this? Are we informing people correctly about this? Are we going to run the risk that people wake up and essentially say, no, we actually want to be wholly anonymous to The Guardian? Because what you really want them to do is sort of say, no, I trust you. I'd actually like to support you. Maybe I could get myself into a revenue model where I'm paying, a modest donation or a modest subscription in exchange for opting out of all of this. And maybe you actually make it a very clear bargain that if you're not able to do this, we are going to surveil you. And if you don't want us to surveil you, here are steps you could take to do it, knowing full well that people probably aren't going to do it. At least it would put it on fairer footing rather than the circumstance that we find ourselves in now.
Well, I'm seeing Alan Rusbridge on Friday, and I'm looking forward to saying after 20 years I was actually wrong about the paywall. We should in fact start charging. Ethan, I can't thank you enough. I just want to sort of thank you again for coming, and every time you come here, and you don't work in a journalism school, but you give us challenges that I think are really important and that journalism schools should take on. So I want to kind of thank you for a brilliant lecture, but also thank you for kind of helping us push this work forward. And it's great to have you here. For everybody else who wants to attend our next one, Jen, it is on we have one on the 2nd of December, which is here, which is Jill Abramson. Oh, sorry, at Yale. It's on the 2nd of December, it's at Yale, and it's James Bamford. And then on the 3rd of December, if you're here, we have Jill Abramson, who will be coming and talking about her role in the New York Times as well. And so I hope to see you then. And again, thank you very much, Ethan. That was great. That was fantastic. Really great.